Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back home here in Bali after being away for some time in Africa. And I'm looking forward to sharing some experiences with you and also learning from you. So today I'm going to talk about the causes of violence against women and girls in conflict. And I wanted to first start off with some definitions to make sure that we're all talking about the same ideas and coming from the same perspective during this discussion. The use of the term violence against women primarily comes from the CEDAW Convention, which I know many countries represented here are state parties, and particularly from General Comment number 19, which is where violence against women is specifically defined to include gender-based violence, and all state parties are called upon to address it. So when we're talking about gender-based violence, because we're going to be talking about violence against women in this session and later on about violence against women, I thought again I would just review some of the concepts. Sorry, I'm getting used to this new technology from the field. Okay. So, gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is any harmful act against a person's will that is rooted in socially assigned differences between males and females. Now, although we use this term gender, which is often associated only with women, in fact, gender-based violence can affect men and boys as well as women and girls. How men and boys are affected may be different from how women and girls are affected, but nonetheless, this is still gender-based violence. So within this subset of GBV, there's violence against women, which can include sexual violence and other forms of violence that are not sexual. Because we're going to be talking about conflict, I am going to focus my discussion primarily on sexual violence, also because this is the type of gender-based violence that often becomes most pronounced in conflict situations. The WHO definition being used by women protection advisors as well as many service providers at the moment for sexual violence is any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances, acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person regardless of their relationship to the victim and in any setting. Now, this is a long technical definition, but I think the main point here is it should be an expansive definition, and it is not limited to acts of rape. There are other forms of sexual violence used besides rape. Within the past several years, the international community, led by a consortium of NGOs and UN agencies, has developed a specific definition for conflict-related sexual violence. And this is incidents or patterns of sexual violence that occur in conflict or post-conflict situations with a direct or indirect link to conflict. Now, how sexual violence may be linked, it can be linked in time. So sexual violence that occurs during or in a post-conflict situation. It can be connected through where the act of violence is committed. So if it's committed in a zone that is occupied or a particular party to a conflict or as part of an attack during conflict. And then it can also be causal. So in other words, for example, there's a military checkpoint. Women are brought to the checkpoint and sexually harassed or abused as part of the military campaign. Now, Esarshi Bangura already prefaced some of the main causes of gender-based violence in conflict situations. Gender-based violence, whether it be in conflict or in peacetime, is rooted in discrimination. So Either directly or indirectly, women and girls may be treated differently from men and boys, which prevents their exercise of their human rights. Discrimination can express itself also in different socioeconomic factors, but socioeconomic factors in themselves can also cause gender-based violence. These include poverty, low levels of education, and health care. Political factors can also lead to gender-based violence and conflict, particularly areas where there's a militarization of society. In other words, power relationships are negotiated through a threat, which does not have to be direct, it can be implicit, of force. So for example, in East Timor, once I had to, appeal to a military member in order to get a driver's license. So when your everyday relationships are negotiated through the militarized structures of society. My colleague Michelle has already begun to discuss this, but I think it's important that we look at the concepts of peacetime versus conflict. It's often a myth that conflict is a break from the normal, and sexual violence or other forms of gender-based violence is something that only happens or particularly happens in conflict. In fact, gender-based violence occurs in conflict on a continuum. The kinds of gender-based violence that occur in peacetime also occur in conflict and occur after the conflict. And you can track the same types of violence. If there's forced marriage prevalent before conflict, during the conflict this will increase or express itself in different ways. And then after the conflict, it will continue. So it's important that we don't think of gender-based violence in conflict being exceptional, but rather part of a continuum. Now, one question that I'm actually raising rather than answering in this presentation is how should ASEAN define conflict for purposes of protection? Currently, parties to conflict in Myanmar are the only actors in ASEAN which have been discussed by the SRSG for sexual violence in its 2014 annual report. There are references to lack of accountability in Cambodia for sexual violence, and there are, Sri Lanka is also discussed as the only other Asian nation, but only in Myanmar has this issue really been raised. And that has to do with the status of conflict. But I think it's important that we think about what stage a conflict should reach before it really becomes an issue of concern. I personally don't think you need to wait for ICRC to declare a particular status of conflict, so IHL applies. I think we need to think about what is an operational definition that can maximize protection in different types of conflict and in different stages of conflict. Now, as I said, that gender-based violence happens on a continuum. There are key differences with peacetime gender-based violence and gender-based violence and conflict, and these are primarily related to the scope, so perhaps the geographic spread of the commission of gender-based violence, the scale, the sheer volume of victims, as well as the types of violence, and then the intent. In other words, sexual violence may be used as a weapon in war, it may be used as a means to affect the ethnic composition of a particular group in an ethnic-based conflict. It may be used as a shaming mechanism, particularly in religious-based conflict. So why sexual violence is used may be different in a conflict situation as compared to peacetime. And in conflict situations, sometimes these acts may rise to the level of international crimes, which may include crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And I know in the packet later you will be receiving, I've included an article by Patricia Sellers, which gives an overview of both the human rights law and international humanitarian law frameworks governing this issue, as well as a history of prosecution of these issues. Now, there are some forms of violence against women and girls that are more likely to occur in a conflict situation. These may include gang rape, particularly in settings when you have loosely affiliated armed groups or where there's child recruitment, and gang rape can be used as a method to socialize or to create bonding among groups of combatants. Mass rape as a particular type of attack. An example of this is in Congo. Rape with military objects as an expression of intimidation, as an expression of military power. Soldiers may rape women with guns or bullets or other military objects. Forced abortion and enforced pregnancy are often or can be features of sexual violence, particularly used in conflicts related to ethnicity, so that abortion or pregnancy are used as means of affecting the ethnic composition of a group or area. Sexual slavery and enforced prostitution or other common forms, again, that happen in peacetime but may be exacerbated in conflict. The comfort women issue is a classic example of this in Asia, where military members may be supplied with women who are abducted or brought into prostitution by other means of coercion. Forced marriage and wife inheritance, and this can be forced marriage by combatants directly, or women who are living in societies where forced marriage is a traditional practice may be more subjected to this due to humanitarian conditions. So a woman may be forced to marry because her family no longer has means to support her in a conflict situation. Or a woman may be forced to marry as a contribution to the war efforts as well. And finally, medical experimentation in a conflict situation. We've talked about briefly the structural causes, but I also wanted to highlight what I call some of the proximate causes. So these are much more field level types of causes. Proxy use of non-state armed groups or just non-state armed groups, often which are described as ill-disciplined or maybe loose, operating under loose command structures, are affiliated with increased levels of sexual violence. Occupation of schools by combatants often leads to increased levels of sexual violence and other forms of violence, and particularly if it's an occupation of a girls' school. Looting, and we often use this term, pillage, but looting of villages, especially if women or girls are caught in the home alone, may lead to sexual violence. Women held in unauthorized detention centers. In a conflict situation, there's a breakdown of rule of law, there's no access to legal representation, and they're more subjected to sexual violence. Women or girls who become child recruits are often subjected to different forms of violence as part of the recruitment process. Women are subjected to, and girls are subjected to sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian aid workers and peacekeepers. There often is an increase in female-headed households and widows, and these women may be subjected to sexual exploitation and abuse related to provision of food and other types of assistance. And also they may be left in environments where there are no protective mechanisms. Often in communities, women may be protected by other male members of the community. If none of the men are home, someone is more likely to come into the home and attack them. Unaccompanied children are probably the most at risk of any kind of violence, but especially sexual violence. And finally, displacement itself can be a proximate cause, and the situations where refugees or IDPs live can create vulnerabilities to sexual violence. And this can include things such as camp design. So latrines that are unseparated, or showers men and women are showering or using bathrooms in the same areas, make the vulnerability to sexual violence higher. So focusing on prevention and response, I just wanted to highlight three particular areas. We have in the last few years developed global monitoring and reporting mechanisms to deal with the issue of violence against women and children in conflict, and particularly sexual violence. There is the monitoring and reporting mechanism, which is administered by Child Protection and Department of Peacekeeping and UNICEF, and that monitors the 6 grave violations against children in conflict, one of which includes sexual violence. Sexual violence is what they call a trigger violation, so that if it is reported as part of this mechanism, it must be communicated to the Security Council through this mechanism. And in South Sudan, where I'm working, we are trying to establish for the first time the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence. This is a tool to monitor and report on acts of conflict-related sexual violence against all ages and genders, so against women and girls as well as men and boys. These are monitoring and reporting mechanisms that go to the Security Council, but they can trigger a referral by the Security Council to the ICC for prosecution. For the sake of time, and because I know tomorrow we're going to be talking about accountability, I won't delve into prosecution and truth-telling, but these can be both preventive and response mechanisms to these issues. But I do want to talk about the development of the global early warning indicators and responses on CRSV. Now, I have included these indicators in the reading packet for those of you who may receive them. Early warning indicators are expressions of the proximate causes that I talked about a few moments ago and field-level signs of conflict-related sexual violence. So some examples of early warning indicators include military checkpoints, how many military checkpoints there are, how many personnel are at military checkpoints, numbers of women and children in detention, particularly unauthorized detention cells. Lack of payment of security forces can be an early warning indicator that sexual violence may happen. And then also prevalence of local cultural practices of things such as forced marriage or enforced prostitution. And these early warning indicators are designed to prevent potential and imminent threats of conflict-related sexual violence, and to address ongoing violence, because sometimes you may have an indicator that violence against women or girls is happening right at this moment, and the idea is to respond as soon as possible and not wait for a legal standard of proof that the violence happened. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the early warning indicators is because when you see them, you'll see of the indicators, only 6 out of the 83 were derived from conflicts that occurred in Asia. The early warning indicators notes where the indicator was seen and why it was included in this matrix. Only 2 out of the 83 are specific to ASEAN, and they're mostly defined in the context of conflicts in Africa. And I raise the question because silence does not equal absence when we're dealing with gender-based violence issues. So I want to ask, why are conflicts in Asia not considered part of this historical survey of indicators of sexual violence, and also really used as a resource for identifying responses? So in a way, I'm making an appeal that early warning indicators need to be mapped historically and for the present context for ASEAN. And then early responses surveyed. So what best practices do you have here in ASEAN, and how can they be used within ASEAN as well as in other regions? And this raises the question, well, why is, surveying early warning indicators of gender-based violence or sexual violence important? And I think it's important because the indicators can be used as a tool to address the silent nature of crimes of GBV. Often, as Bangura and Michelle noted, women or men are afraid to report of sexual violence, and often it can be overlooked in other assessments of human rights violations, where killings or other types of violations may be given more prominence, although the prevalence of gender-based violence is quite high. I live and breathe right now these indicators because often I cannot prove a case because I may not be able to confirm using multiple sources and incidents. That means I have trouble mobilizing resources if I cannot prove that something happened. But what I can use without having to subject a victim to a strenuous verification process are these indicators. Michelle talked earlier about it's very hard to quantify the issue of sexual violence if you're looking at number of confirmed cases. But you can often quantify indicators. How many checkpoints, right? How many forced marriages are reported, not in conflict, but to traditional elders in a region pre and post. So I invite you to look at the indicators and think about how those can be used to quantify the potential or the threat of sexual violence, both in peacetime and in conflict. And that may be one way to identify responses that can be prepared now, even if there's no conflict ongoing, or that can be levied the moment there's indications that a conflict is escalating. And I also invite you to look at the global indicators because I think they're very useful as a model for if there's a conflict in a particular area, how to map potential imminent and ongoing threats. And finally, I think it's important to look at the early warning indicators and the responses because prevention is the key. There is no perfect accountability process, and prevention is always more effective, as Ms. Bangura noted, effective in terms of cost, but most importantly, prevention is more effective in securing the safety and well-being of victims. Thank you very much.